Hello, the topic for today is the article by Don Marquis entitled Why Abortion is Immoral. This is part of the unit in applied ethics. We're going to be taking a look at the way that professional ethicists take a look at certain major issues in applied ethics. And we're going to see a pretty famous account here by Marquis. This is one of the most sort of printed and sort of reprinted articles that there is in the literature on applied ethics. And it's famous for a reason. It's pretty good. So here is a photograph of Professor Marquis. Dr. Marquis is very well known in the field of medical ethics. He's currently an emeritus professor of philosophy at the University of Kansas. Emeritus professor is a kind of semi-retirement. The teaching load tends to be down, but emeritus professors still very often work with graduate students and sort of do work that still contributes to the field, and they still receive support from the university in doing that. So that's Professor Marquis there. I should mention I went to graduate school at the University of Kansas, so I am acquainted with Dr. Marquis, and just looking at the specific shade of that chalkboard, I know exactly what classroom that is. That was very often used by the philosophy department there. So brings back a few memories. So one of the things that is really great about Professor Marquis's article is that it starts with an addressing some common just bad arguments that are very typical in the way that people usually talk about abortion. As it says here in the notes, he identifies a pair of very common arguments in the abortion debate, and of course, neither of those arguments is really any good. Another way of putting that is they're really bad arguments that that really address the issues in a bad way, and yet again these issues tend to dominate the popular discussion of the ethics of abortion. So it's worth taking some time to really go through a couple of these perspectives and really get a good understanding of why they're bad arguments, right? Why they don't really address the core of the issue. And again, I think Marquis's article does this as well as anybody's. So the arguments that are really bad are what we refer to as personhood arguments, right? They're arguments about the moral status of a fetus, right? Whether it is a person or not, or whether it's a human or not, or whether it's whatever, okay? And again, you'll probably notice how common discussion is on that kind of a topic. You will have probably thought that that's all that there is, right, to the topic of abortion, is like, where do you draw the line? Where does life begin? Where does, all that sort of stuff. All that stuff we're going to lump in here. We're going to call these personhood arguments, and they're really bad arguments, and they're really irrelevant to the ethics of the situation, again, even though those are the arguments that most people tend to use. So let's focus on one example of these kinds of personhood arguments. This is a personhood argument that argues for abortion being impermissible, right? This is a kind of anti-abortion argument here. And so the way that it goes is that it starts off with the premise that fetuses are human. And you'll notice I've got in this little parentheses, feti, right? Because, and if this is an issue you really don't care about, go ahead and just fast forward in the video about a minute. And if I'm still talking about this, then, I'm sorry. But sometimes when English imports certain words into English from other languages, especially Latin, sometimes we'll input the plurals, right? So, for example, the word matrices is the plural of the word matrix, right? Singular. You see, bacterium is singular, bacteria is plural, and again, that's the Latin plural. And of course, the ever popular fungi is the popular of fungus, right? And so it might seem as if the plural of fetus, which is a Latin word, should be feti. It is not. The word fetus in Latin is a fourth declension noun, and so its plural is fetus, right? I mean, the actual native Latin speakers would have used inflections of fetus versus fetus, and that would have been the difference. But in terms of spelling, there's no difference. And so So that's why the plural is, in fact, not feti, right? It's fetuses, right? We've anglicized the word, and keeping the Roman plural would just be confusing. So that's why that. Okay, so here we go. The premise is that fetuses are human, and of course, that goes for human fetuses. When we're talking about fetuses in this context, we're talking about human fetuses. Of course, cat fetuses are cats, right? But again, when we say fetus here, we sort of imply human fetus. Okay, and so second premise is it's wrong to kill humans. Okay, that seems perfectly plausible. And so if you sort of combine those two statements in the right way, it looks like we have a perfectly valid argument here that says that abortion is, is impermissible, assuming that abortion kills a fetus, right? That's we're just going to take that as part of the definition of the word abortion there, that in some sense goes without saying in a special premise. So if abortion is the act of killing a fetus, right, and fetuses are human, if it's wrong to kill humans, then abortion is wrong, right, impermissible. So there's the argument, at least sketched out in a very basic way. So what could be wrong with that? Well, here's what's wrong with it. The trouble is that the argument equivocates on the definition of the word human in this case. The word human doesn't always mean exactly the same thing. In fact, there are at least two definitions of human that are in play in an argument of this kind. One sense of the term human means to describe a member of the species Homo sapiens or something of the genus Homo, right? There's, of course, discussion among paleoanthropologists about the status of other members of genus Homo, such as, Homo neanderthalensis, Homo habilis, perhaps, and some of those others, sort of, again, members of our genus, but not necessarily our species. But in any case, we're going to be taking a look at, a member of the species Homo sapiens. When we mean human, we mean, in some sense, biologically human, right? That's what one meaning of the word human is. A second meaning of the word human, okay, is when we talk about a person, right, in the moral sense, right, one who is worthy of moral consideration, and that's how we use the term in a phrase like human rights or human dignity. Again, we're not using the term to mean anything biological in those senses. We're using the term human to be something moral, right, almost in the sense of the word humane, right? I mean, that's the root, that's the connotation we have with that. Now, of course, these are very different definitions, and so the question is, does the word human that we see as used in the argument here in the first premise and here in the second, are we using the same definition of human in both of those cases, or are we using different definitions of human in both of those cases? Okay, and so it'll be a good illustration to try one after the other and see how that ends up working out. So let's take a look and see what happens if we use sense one, right? Remember, sense one is human. It means a member of the species Homo sapiens. That is, we're using the biological sense of the word human. And so if you look at premise one, the idea that fetuses, again, human fetuses, are human, okay, that seems perfectly fine. That seems trivially true. Of course, human fetuses are human in the biological sense. What else would they be? Aliens, right? No. And so, of course, then sense two, it is wrong to kill humans. That's where we start to run into trouble. Because while one seems trivially true given sense one of the word human, premise two, the idea that it's wrong to kill humans, is it that they are biologically human that makes it wrong to kill them? Is it a fact of biology that we're talking about here? Well, no. Okay, what does biology have to do with morality, right? Of course, imagine growing a piece of like an organ or something like that. If you imagine growing a liver in a vat or something like that, it's a human liver, and might say it's a living thing. There are living liver cells and all that sort of stuff, and according to the DNA, it's human liver cells. But does it follow that it's morally wrong to kill that liver? It doesn't seem any more wrong than killing a cabbage, frankly. But that's again, that's what would be implied in some sense by sense two here. It's wrong to kill something that's biologically human. Again, what does biology have to do with morality? And so that's the problem with using sense one in both of these cases. Well, let's try then using sense two. Okay, so if we instead say fetuses are human in the second sense of the term, right? Human as in a person, that is one who is worthy of moral consideration. Now the problem is that premise 2 looks perfectly fine. That looks, in fact, just trivially true. Of course, it's wrong to kill things that are worthy of moral consideration, right? That seems almost true by definition. It's the first premise now that seems to be a problem. The problem is that it becomes a circular argument. So you say, look, fetuses are worthy of moral consideration, right at the top. Well, the question is whether it's right or wrong to kill them. And so if you start out asserting that they're worthy of moral consideration, then what you're doing is you're assuming as true the thing that you're supposed to be proving, right? It's a form of circular reasoning, and that makes the argument bad. Okay, so if we use sense 1, we have a premise that doesn't look to be obviously true at all. If we use sense 2, in both cases, we get a circular argument. Well, what happens then if you use sense 1, right, for the first premise and sense 2 for the second? Okay, now each of the premises is fine. They both even, sort of trivially true, almost true by definition, but now the argument is actually invalid. Right, and this is what's called equivocation. And when you use the same word but in two different ways in an argument, it doesn't actually turn out valid. So, for example, if I said, drugs are illegal and aspirin is a drug, therefore aspirin is illegal, right? That sounds valid, but it isn't, because the drug in one sense means to refer to an illegal or controlled substance. Drug in the other sense refers to anything that's used for medicinal purposes, right? And those aren't the same sense of the word. And so if you're using one definition in one premise and another definition in another premise, it's not really a valid argument. Okay, it just looks like it is until you start looking at definitions. So this argument it's bad, right? And so it doesn't really lead us anywhere, despite the fact that it's so very commonly repeated. So let us then take a look at the other side of the coin, right? A kind of argument that says that abortion is morally permissible, the so-called pro-choice argument. I'm not in love with the term pro-choice because it would imply that there's somebody who's anti-choice, and I'm not sure that that's. I think they're probably more often slogans than they really reflect somebody's actual considered view. I think people's actual considered views are probably more nuanced than either sort of one thing or another. In any case, if you want to call this a kind of pro-choice argument, fine. But you'll notice it's very, very common, and it's not actually any better than the previous. So the argument goes something like: Premise 1, fetuses are not persons. Premise 2, it's only wrong to kill persons, okay? And therefore, abortion is permissible, again, given the idea that abortion is the killing of a fetus, okay? So, again, just like with the word human, the word person is ambiguous. There are two different possible definitions you could give, reasonable definitions of the word person that people do in fact use. One of those definitions is that a person means somebody with a certain set of psychological features, for example, rationality, right, or self-consciousness, or some kind of self-awareness, etc. So that's what we tend to mean by a person in the psychological sense. Another way we sometimes use the word person is as sort of a synonym of human in this sense, as one who is worthy of moral consideration, right? Personhood in the moral sense, as opposed to just merely the psychological sense. And so again, these are two distinct uses of the term. And I think you'll notice a pattern in the way that that we demonstrate the flaws of this argument. So again, let's try and see what happens if we use the first sense of that first definition of person, the psychological sense, in both of these premises. So we get premise 1, excuse me, that says that fetuses are not persons. Okay, that is, persons in the psychological sense. That is, that they lack certain features, for example, rationality. Well, that's completely true. You're not gonna play chess with a fetus anytime soon, and it's not just because they're they can't hold the pieces. That it's just not gonna happen. They don't have that degree of rationality. And of course, then if you say it's only wrong to kill persons, now all of a sudden it's the second premise that looks really problematic. Like what what about rationality makes it the case that you can't kill something, right? I mean, for instance, you know, right after an infant is born, right? Infants are no more rational than fetuses. Does that mean it's okay to kill them? Small children again are no more rational than infants in most cases. Is it okay to kill them? There are people who have certain mental deficiencies that have about the degree of rationality as your standard infant or small child. Again, is it okay to kill them? People in an advanced degree of senility, are they sort of who cares about? Again, there's a real question here. What does psychology have to do with morality? Maybe something, but just the mere presence of certain psychological features doesn't seem like it's enough. And in fact, if you're going to have to really define that in the same way that just mere biology doesn't seem like it's morally relevant either. So this argument has the problem that premise 2, if you use sense 1, really comes out as being problematic. Okay, so 1 turns out again to be obviously true, but then 2 is problematic. So the second, if we use person in the sense of worthy of moral consideration, again, number 2 looks fine. It's only wrong to kill things that are worthy of moral consideration. Again, 2 seems like it's true by definition. It's 1 that turns out to be the problem because it basically, again, begs the question. It makes this a circular argument. It says, oh, no, fetuses are not worthy of moral consideration. And so I'm going to prove then that it's okay to kill them because based on the fact that they're not worthy of moral consideration. And again, it's a circular argument. You're supposed to be proving that fetuses are not morally worth consideration in order to prove that abortion is permissible. You shouldn't just be asserting it off the top, right? So again, it's a question-begging premise. So again, that's not going to work. And if we use sense 1 and sense 2 in the same argument, again, we have equivocation and turns out to be invalid. So you'll see that for very, very similar reasons, the whole debate about personhood is a really it's a blind alley, right? It's a non-productive avenue of exploration. It doesn't turn out to reveal anything that at least is obviously morally relevant here. Okay. So we're going to be looking for something else, and again, I think Marquis's case is really well made for the deficiencies of the kinds of arguments that you very often hear about abortion, and so we're going to again look for something else. And so what Marquis wants to do is he wants to say, all right, let's start from somewhere else. Let's start from the idea of trying to examine what is so wrong with killing us, you and me, right? Your standard adult human being. Okay, and his general idea is that the reason, if you really think about that, he says the reason that you're going to end up identifying, the most plausible reason you're going to identify for why it's wrong to kill the standard adult human being is going to apply equally well to cases of abortion, which is going to then indicate that they're in general seriously morally wrong. Okay. And so his goal is to provide a rationale, right, to describe one among many accounts of why killing in general is wrong, and to also show that then that principle applies to fetuses as well as to adults, even if fetuses are not human or are not persons or are not whatever you want to say that they are. Okay. And his goal is to prevent an account that does not make voluntary euthanasia wrong. Okay, that's one thing that he thinks should be your account of the wrongness of killing should be able to take into account, right, why, say something like, generally murder or abortion might be wrong, but voluntary euthanasia in a kind of, in the case of someone who's terminally ill, might not be, though, again, perhaps it might be wrong for other reasons. He also wants to avoid a kind of the implication of making contraception wrong, right? Because he thinks that would be an undesirable side effect of the theory. He also doesn't want to invoke religious reasoning in any way, shape, or form, again, because for reasons covered very early in this course, it's not relevant to the moral facts of the issue. And finally, he wants to rely on the status. He doesn't want to rely on the status of the fetus as a person. Okay, and so for the sake of argument, Marquis is going to grant that a fetus is not a person or a human or whatever you want to say it is that's supposed to grant its moral status. He's rather going to say that what makes killing it wrong is the same thing that makes killing you or me wrong, even if it's not what you and I are. Okay, and it's a really clever part of his account. And so let's take a look at the account then. What is wrong with killing you or me? What is wrong with killing a standard adult human being? And if you start to, ask people questions, it's a harder question than it sounds like. You'd be like, what do you mean what's wrong? It's probably a question you've never bothered to ask, but it's a pretty basic moral question, right? That's supposed to have a pretty basic moral answer. But Marcus is like, no, really, ask the question, really think about it. Because as it turns out, lots of times people will end up getting answers that are sort of implausible, right? And so it certainly does seem that the wrongness of killing should be located in what it does to its victims, okay, as opposed to, say, barbarizing the perpetrator, right? After all, if nothing in itself is wrong with killing, how would it barbarize somebody? So one of the things that sometimes people will say, right, if you ask, what's wrong with killing you or me? Someone will say, well, imagine the kind of person it would make you if you did that to somebody or something like that. It's like, well, again, why would it make you into some kind of a bad person if there wasn't actually anything wrong with it? So that gets a hold of the wrong end of the spectrum. Somebody might say something like, well, what about your friends or family and all the, the people that depend on you and love you and all that stuff? And, how would they feel if you were killed? Okay. And of course, that seems to imply that if somebody didn't have any friends or any family or anybody that depended on them, it would be perfectly okay to kill them. And that seems totally wrong. So again, it seems like the harm that killing seems to do is that it deprives somebody of something, namely their lives, or rather their futures. Okay, if you kill me, for example, you would take away my future. Somebody killed you, they would take away your future. And that seems to be a really substantial harm. And that seems to be what we focus on when we think about what is so bad about killing your average adult human being. Okay, or rather, what it is that you have been deprived of something valuable, namely the values that you would have in your future. Okay, so Marquis's account of killing here says that killing is wrong. Like again, killing your standard adult human being is wrong because it deprives the victim of the valuable experiences that are in their future. Right, so it deprives them of the value of their future. Now, of course, how do you know what their future is like? Well, I mean, no one exactly knows, but in general, we can make the reasonable assumption that somebody else's future is more or less as valuable to them as yours is to you. And so we think of, the value of a future like ours. Sometimes that's how this account is phrased. Okay. And so that brings up the question, of course, how can one tell when a future is valuable? And the answer is when it's a future like ours, right? If in general, right, we assume that, people have some of the same basic needs, right? They have, of course, the what people expect out of life might differ in some very particular things, but in general, you or I or your neighbor or your brother or your mom all have, essentially a future like yours or mine, etc. Right? So if it's a future more or less like ours, we're going to assume that it's valuable. And so if we're talking about this kind of value, then the next step of the argument goes something like this, right? A fetus has a future like ours, and so then abortion is wrong for the same reason that murder of innocent adults is wrong, because it deprives them of the value of their future. Okay. And again, that would be the case even if a fetus is not a person, right? It does have a future like ours, even if it's not human, if you want to say that, if it's not alive, if that's what you want to, fine. It can be none of those things. It could even not even be a potential human or something like that. If you want to worry about potentiality, again, if it has a future like yours, then this account of the wrongness of killing will apply to it. All right. And so what this does is this constitutes a kind of prima facie reason for the wrongness of abortion, but it is possible for other ethical principles to intervene. And so you'll notice I've pointed out here that really the proper term for this is pro tanto. All right, again, prima facie says, well, it might be a reason, it might look like a reason, but might not turn out to be. When I think really what Marquis here means using prima facie is, he means pro tanto, and it's just that's prima facie has become, a term that gets used in a certain way in philosophy, despite everything. So a caution about this. just because this is a very common student mistake, sometimes students will see the term prima facie and say, oh, I saw that specialized term in Ross's writings. That must mean that Marquis thinks the same thing as Ross thinks. And so good if you notice, right, that phrase and where it came from and where else we've discussed it. That's good. But consider this, right? Both of the authors also use the word morality, and that doesn't mean that they have the same thing in mind when they use the term, or that they all agree on everything. They use lots of the same words and not just. So again, prima facie is a word that has a wide usage, and so you can use the word without necessarily meaning to adopt the entirety of W.D. Ross's moral theory here. And in fact, if you look at Marquis's account, is Marquis arguing that there's a whole constellation of moral duties that you're going to have that are going to sometimes compete with each other? And it doesn't appear as if Marquis is in fact arguing that. And so again, don't make the mistake of assuming that because Marquis uses the term prima facie that he must in some sense wholesale adopt the ethical theory of somebody else who also happens to use that term. The term has a kind of independent meaning, right? What Marquis means when he says that there's a prima facie reason that abortion is wrong is because, like many other things, right, there can be other things that weigh against this, right? So, for example, you might imagine something like the trolley problem, right, where the idea is you have to, play this sort of, question about, what you have, sort of 5 lives on one end and one life on the other end. You might say, well, okay, look, in general, it is morally wrong to do something that will result in somebody's life ending. But in this case, it sort of looks like you want to choose one person's life ending as opposed to 5, and that seems better in some sense, right? And so again, in general, it's wrong to end a life, but there may be circumstances in which something else might outweigh that consideration of the value of somebody's future. And Marquis is saying just exactly that, is that the loss of a future is a very, very bad moral consequence. But it's possible that in certain cases, other also very bad moral consequences, perhaps worse, might weigh against it. So let's take a quick moment to do, this is what we call a sanity check. So this is where we step back and take a look at just the basic nuts and bolts of the idea, just to see if it squares with a very standard way of thinking, right? If it fits well with the other reasonable ideas that we think we have about morality. So Marquis himself does this. He points out a lot of the implications that his theory has, a lot of the ways that his theory applies to sort of other kinds of moral questions, the various kinds of things it explains well. And so it explains certainly why certain decisions are made prioritizing the lives of the young over the lives of the old, right? That's one thing we can think of. One prominent example I can think of from recent times is when the tsunami hit, the Fukushima nuclear reactor in Japan, causing it to, essentially fail. Some of the people who stayed behind, one of the things that one of the decisions that was made was that the people who would stay behind and try and make sure everything, got locked down properly, that would be subject to, a higher radiation risk, would be older people, whereas younger people were evacuated. And part of the reasoning for that is that if you're older, right, you've got there's less of an impact on your overall life expectancy with a kind of radiation exposure of that kind, and also it can cause if there are reproductive effects, well, younger people may not have had all the children they were going to have, whereas people who are much older probably have already had all the children that they were going to. And so again, there's a certain kind of an issue where the idea is that you're really taking it into account what you would be depriving from somebody if they stayed behind to help lock down this nuclear plant versus what you wouldn't. And it makes sense to try and deprive people of less, right, than rather than more. So that's a kind of case where you might say that this sort of value of the future idea really did seem to come into play and seemed to make sense when it did. It would explain why certain exceptions, right, to abortion's wrongness must be very serious. Okay, and so some of the kinds of very common objections that are, the common exceptions that even people who think that abortion is generally morally wrong will make, including Marquis, are cases where there is a medical danger, right, to the pregnant person's life, or else that the pregnancy was involuntary in some way, that is maybe perhaps due to a rape or something similar to that. And so on the one hand, if the pregnancy threatens somebody's life, well, now all of a sudden you have the value of a future to weigh against the value of a future, and that might make sense as to why you could see at least making an exception in that case. In the case of an involuntary pregnancy or a rape or something like this, you're dealing with a very serious injustice that's done to somebody, and that again might be substantial enough to weigh against the value of a future, and so you might see why somebody would think about exceptions in cases like that. And so again, that seems so far so good. Further, it seems like the wrong-making features can apply just as well to non-persons as to persons. Okay, and so one thing that Marquis mentions in the text is cases of animal suffering or animal rights. He says, look, it may well be that some non-human animals have a future that is similar enough to our own to be valuable to them, and then that would mean it would be wrong to kill them too. And if that really is the case, that seems like it would be a good reason, right, to not kill a particular non-human animal. Something that Marquis has mentioned in person and in lectures and things like that. He said, look, if there turn out to be aliens out there somewhere whose futures are more or less like ours, it would be wrong to kill them too. And so again, it seems like this value of a future account of the wrongness of killing really does tend to track with a lot of our other intuitions about morality. So let's now talk about voluntary euthanasia for a minute. He does mention this briefly. I think it's worth a little bit more of a discussion here. Again, the idea is that voluntary euthanasia may be wrong for other reasons, but it seems permissible, at least in the sense that if a person's future really does hold no value to them, then they aren't really deprived of anything in losing it, right? So we're thinking of cases in which somebody may have a condition, right, a medical condition, in which their future is limited and is assured of containing nothing but a lot of pain and suffering, right? And so such a future really would not be valuable. At least at a certain point, depending on the severity of the pain and suffering. And so, that seems to be a very different issue than sometimes some people who maybe are depressed or they're going through something, who become suicidal, who may believe that their future holds no value to them, but might really be wrong about that. Okay, whereas so when someone when someone has the correct idea that their future really holds no value to them, it seems like it ought to be permissible for them to for cases of voluntary euthanasia, something like that. So again, this sort of future, this deprivation of the future account of the wrongness of killing, again seems to track some fairly plausible moral intuitions about voluntary euthanasia. Okay, and again, that's very different from a more ordinary case of suicide, because a person's future in most cases does have value to them even when they don't think it does. Okay, something like a terminal illness or the presence of a great deal of suffering really does change that story. One other issue that Marquis addresses that is a very interesting part of his account is the way that it handles contraception. And the reason it's interesting is because a lot of arguments for the impermissibility of abortion rely on some kind of a sort of sanctity of life concept or argument. And in general, such points are too broad, right? So again, if all life is sacred, well, then it's hard to justify something like eating a cabbage, and that's too broad, right? So if you want to say, okay, fine, only human life is sacred, okay, why? Number one, right? What's maybe that's even a little too narrow, but the idea is that if all human life is sacred, sometimes these kinds of again sanctity of life kinds of points or arguments have the strange consequence that even contraception is somehow immoral, and that doesn't tend to track with most people's moral intuitions. And again, this is an area where Marquis's account really comes in into its own and has a really interesting way of looking at things. So again, remember the account is if the reason that it's wrong to kill you or me is because it would deprive something of a valuable future, there's a future like ours, then we can apply that in some sense to a case of contraception, right? And we would see that it would be morally permissible to use contraception because in preventing a conception, the question is who is actually harmed. Okay, what's wrong with killing somebody is what happens when you do it. That there's like a being that has a future that you take that future away from. But in the term in a case of contraception, there never is an entity that has a future like ours. For example, if the entities concerned here are egg cells and sperm cells, right? And egg cells all by themselves do not have futures like ours. Sperm cells do not have futures like ours. Only once you actually have, an actual fetus that develops from this process do you get something that does plausibly have a future like ours. But prior to that process, it does not. And so, this is a byproduct of Marquis's account that contraception is perfectly morally permissible, right? Because again there's not any entity that actually is harmed by having a future deprived of it, right? You might say there's a potential entity that gets deprived of something, but it's morally questionable whether potential entities have rights or are worthy of moral consideration. Again, it's only when something actually has a future like ours that it would harm them to take it away from them. So that's Marquis's account with respect to contraception. And so the last thing I want to mention is a couple of crucial questions, okay, that are addressed in this kind of an account here. Number one, okay, in what kinds of cases would abortion be morally permissible? Because I think you'll notice that Marquis does talk about various kinds of exceptions, right, and what might motivate those kinds of exceptions. And I think it's worth really thinking very carefully about how those exceptions really do apply. And so, if it is in general seriously morally wrong to deprive something of the value of a future like ours, what kinds of exceptions, what kinds of considerations are weighty enough to weigh against the value of a future like ours? I think a fairly easy case would be cases where somebody's life is put in danger by carrying a pregnancy to term. That's because now you're weighing a valuable future directly against another valuable future, and I think that in those cases it's fairly clear that's weighty enough. In some places, Marquis has sort of written that, of course, something like abortion in the case of involuntary pregnancy, e.g., rape, would be justified. I tend to think this is a reasonable exception to make in general, and many people do. I wonder whether Marquis's account really does make adequate room for that intuition, right? Because it seems like does the value of the future diminish based on how it got here, right? I mean, is there really room for this in Marquis's theory? And the answer is I don't know, maybe, right? Maybe not. Okay, that's why it's an interesting question. And then, of course, the question you should be asking the whole time, anytime you see anything in applied ethics, you say, what kind of moral theory does Marquis appeal to here? Okay, and you should be thinking that the whole way you go through, because the idea is you're going to want to use what you know about certain kinds of moral theories to really, to anticipate what kinds of reasonable objections there might be, right? So, for example, and again, if you I think really reflect on this, you'll see that Marquis's theory here is pretty broadly consequentialist. Right. The idea is that his focus on the wrongness of killing is what's wrong about killing is what happens after you do it. Right. What's wrong about killing is its effect. Right. That it deprives somebody of something valuable. Right? And so, though he doesn't appear to use any of the language of something like classic utilitarianism, he certainly doesn't appear to be a hedonist. He does appear to think that it's primarily the consequences that are the wrong-making features of at least these kinds of acts. And so, if you think about some of the difficulties with consequentialist theories like utilitarianism, you'll be able to anticipate some reasonable objections. Perhaps going for better consequences may have you tolerate certain kinds of injustice. Perhaps the consequence, going for better consequences, might be too demanding, right, on people, right? These are well-known objections you already saw with respect to consequentialist theories of morality. Right. But in general, always think whenever moral arguments are made, is like, what kind of moral argument is this? Right? Because in general, it will be an argument about consequences, or it will be an argument about rights and duties, or it will be a kind of argument about character. And in general, it's gonna fit in one of those sorts of things. And so using what you know about those kinds of moral approaches can help you get a really good handle on thinking productively about such cases.